The sun had barely risen over London, and yet inside Buckingham Palace, an announcement was shaking the foundations of the monarchy. The world was about to witness a moment that few could have predicted, a moment that would send shockwaves not only through royal corridors, but across every news outlet, every social feed, and every living room in the world. Prince Harry, known for his impassioned defiance and unfiltered responses, had just received news that would push him to the brink. The palace had officially announced a new direction for the monarchy. Prince William would now assume leadership in a manner that left Harry's role uncertain, his influence diminished, and his emotions unchecked. And the response? Screams. Yes, screams that echoed through the halls of royal history. A raw, unguarded display of fury and disbelief. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Can you imagine being a prince, part of one of the most famous families in the world, and suddenly being told that your path, your position, your very legacy, has shifted in a heartbeat? That's exactly what Harry was feeling. And if you think you know Harry, you know that calm reflection isn't exactly his first instinct. He is a man of action, of immediate, visceral reaction. And in this moment, every nerve, every thought, every ounce of his royal upbringing seemed to combust into a perfect storm of shock and outrage. But before we dive into what happened in those first explosive hours, it's worth asking, why now? Why announce this seismic change at this exact point in time? The palace, we've learned, didn't choose this moment lightly. Behind closed doors, advisors whispered of timing, optics, and the fragile balance of public perception. The world has been watching Harry and William for decades. Children now grown into men, heirs now stepping into the shadows and the limelight. The stakes have never been higher, and the palace knew that every word, every gesture, every carefully curated photo would be dissected by millions. Harry's reaction was, in many ways, predictable. But even predictable reactions can shock when delivered in such unfiltered, raw form. Witnesses close to the prince describe him pacing, voice rising, hands clenched into fists. His fury wasn't just about the announcement, it was about the symbolism. The shift in leadership was not merely administrative, it was a statement. It was the crown's way of saying, William leads, and Harry, you are no longer central to the story. Can you imagine receiving that message? Can you imagine every moment of your life, every public appearance, every family gathering, suddenly reframed in this context? And then there was Meghan. While Harry's anger was fiery, Meghan's response was markedly different. Calm, collected, strategic, she understood, perhaps better than anyone, the optics of the moment. She recognized that Harry's screams, as human and understandable as they were, would be scrutinized and broadcast in a way that could either undermine or amplify their influence. The tension between Harry's raw emotion and Meghan's calculated poise added another layer of intrigue, another angle for the world to speculate on. And speculate they did. Within minutes, the palace corridors were abuzz, whispers spread like wildfire, and journalists outside the gates waited with cameras poised, hungry for any sign of the unfolding drama. Yet, the announcement wasn't just about family dynamics. It was about history, legacy, and the shifting face of monarchy in the modern era. Prince William stepping into a central leadership role is more than a personal advancement. It's a signal to the public, a recalibration of tradition, a nod to the future of the British monarchy. But for Harry, it felt like betrayal. A calculated move that disregarded the blood, sweat, and tears he had poured into his own royal duties. How do you reconcile duty and emotion when both seem to pull you in opposite directions? How do you process betrayal when it comes not from strangers, but from those you grew up with, those you trusted? And as if the tension wasn't enough, there were whispers of secret letters, of backroom meetings, of advisors who may have tipped the scales. These letters, some say, could rewrite perceptions of loyalty, ambition, and intent. They could reveal truths that have been hidden for decades. They could, quite literally, change the story we think we know about the monarchy. And the timing of their revelation? Perfect, terrifying, unavoidable. For Harry, the intersection of public scrutiny, private betrayal, and media frenzy was a crucible, and he was at its center. Now, let's not underestimate the weight of the palace announcement. We're not talking about a routine press release or a ceremonial adjustment. We're talking about a fundamental restructuring of power within one of the most scrutinized institutions in history. The implications ripple far beyond the family. They affect the public perception of the monarchy, the political conversations in the UK, and the cultural narrative that spans generations. And for Harry, who has always navigated the delicate balance of privacy and public life, this was a seismic upheaval. His personal identity, his public persona, and his familial connections were all thrown into question in one fell swoop. So what did Harry do first? Did he call advisors? Did he retreat to private quarters? Or did he respond in the way we've come to expect, instinctively, passionately, without a filter? According to multiple insider accounts, his response was explosive. Words were shouted, doors were slammed, and throughout it all, Meghan remained the calm eye of the storm, offering counsel, restraint, but also strategic insight. It's a dynamic that has defined their public narrative for years, but in this instance, it added tension and intrigue that no outside observer could ignore. And the world noticed. Within moments of the palace's announcement, the story broke across every major news outlet. Social media lit up with speculation, opinion, and outrage. Memes, commentary, and expert analyses flooded timelines. The public was witnessing not just a royal announcement, but the emotional fallout in real time. For Harry, this was a crucible moment. The prince who once seemed untouchable, invulnerable, now exposed every raw emotion to the world. Anger, disbelief, frustration. They were all on display. But the intrigue doesn't stop at Harry's reaction. What about William? What about Charles? What about Camilla? How did they respond behind closed doors? How were alliances shifting, power consolidating, and influence being wielded in ways the public couldn't yet see? The palace is a theater of strategy, and in moments like this, every gesture, every word, every expression is part of a larger play. And Harry, for all his passion, is only one character in this unfolding drama, a central one, yes, but far from the only player in the game. And just when you think the story couldn't get more intense, there's a twist, a revelation that insiders say could shock even the most jaded royal watchers. Something hidden for years, now threatening to surface in the wake of the announcement. Something that could redefine Harry's position, his legacy, and the very public perception of loyalty and betrayal within the royal family. And that's where we leave the introduction, on the edge of revelation, with questions that demand answers, and attention that promises drama beyond what anyone could have imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The morning air in London carried a strange stillness, as if the city itself knew something monumental had just occurred. Buckingham Palace, usually a symbol of timeless tradition and ceremonial calm, had erupted into a storm of whispers, hurried footsteps, and urgent meetings. Inside, the corridors were alive with tension, advisors pacing, aides whispering in corners, and the distant echo of doors opening and closing in rapid succession. And at the heart of it all stood Prince Harry, the prince who had always walked a tightrope between rebellion and duty, suddenly caught in the crossfire of history. How do you react when the rules of your life are rewritten in an instant? When the very institution that defined your identity decides, without warning, that your role has changed? Harry had to process that question, and process it fast. The palace announcement was simple on the surface, almost bureaucratic. Prince William would now take on a more centralized leadership role in the monarchy. Yet, beneath the words lay a tectonic shift in power, influence, and family dynamics. For Harry, it was more than a change in title. It was a statement, a declaration that, for all his efforts, his prominence in the royal narrative was being diminished. The news had not leaked gradually. There were no careful hints, no softening of the blow. One moment, Harry was preparing for a routine morning, and the next, a message arrived through the palace channels that felt like a hammer striking his core. He read it once, disbelief etched across his face. He read it twice, anger beginning to bubble. By the third reading, he could no longer contain it. The letters, the phrasing, the implications, they were unmistakable. William was stepping forward, and Harry, for all intents and purposes, was stepping back. Immediately, emotions collided. Shock, rage, betrayal, confusion. Every fiber of his being seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment. How could this happen? How could the very institution that shaped him, nurtured him, and placed him on a path of duty seemingly disregard his position so completely? And yet, the message was clear. The monarchy was evolving, and Harry was being forced to evolve, or risk being left behind entirely. The palace staff watched in a mixture of awe and apprehension. Few had ever witnessed Harry in such a raw, unfiltered state. He paced the hallways, running his hands through his hair, muttering under his breath, each word a fragment of disbelief. Meghan, by contrast, observed with a calm intensity that contrasted sharply with Harry's storm. She understood the optics instantly, recognizing that every movement, every expression, every outburst would be scrutinized by the world outside those palace walls. Her presence was steadying yet strategic, a silent reminder that even in the midst of chaos, control could still be maintained. But let's not underestimate Harry's perspective. This was not merely a personal slight, it was a public spectacle. The announcement would be broadcast, dissected, and debated across every news channel, every social media platform, every conversation. And for Harry, whose relationship with the media has been a defining, often painful aspect of his life, the timing was almost cruel. His private fury would inevitably become public fodder. How could he express his outrage without it being twisted, misrepresented, or weaponized against him? Meanwhile, William's camp was already calculating the consequences. The announcement was meticulously crafted, every word chosen to convey stability, continuity, and leadership. It was a masterclass in royal communication. William's advisors anticipated every potential reaction, every misstep, every point of leverage. They knew that Harry's temperament, his past actions, and his media presence would ensure a response, but they had prepared for it. And yet, even with all the preparation, no one could predict the intensity of Harry's initial reaction, the sheer, unbridled force of his anger as he confronted a reality he had never anticipated. The public would soon witness fragments of this reaction, carefully edited and filtered, but behind closed doors, it was raw. Sources describe raised voices, slammed doors, and a flurry of urgent conversations. Every aide, every official, every family member felt the weight of the moment. And amid the chaos, Harry tried to understand how things had come to this. Was it a calculated move? A response to perceived failures? Or was it simply the palace asserting its authority in a time of uncertainty? The timing was critical. The monarchy, in recent years, had faced a series of public relations challenges. Scandals, departures, and revelations had tested the institution's resilience. In this context, William's ascendancy was positioned as a stabilizing force, a signal to the public that the crown was not only enduring but actively preparing for the future. But for Harry, it felt like an erasure of identity, a dismissal of his contributions, and a personal betrayal from the very family he had sworn to support. Inside the palace, allies and advisors scrambled to manage the fallout. Every conversation was calculated, every message considered for its potential impact on both Harry and the wider world. Historical precedent provided some guidance, but the modern landscape, with social media, 24-hour news cycles, and global scrutiny, made each decision exponentially more complex. And in this environment, Harry's response was both human and unpredictable, a storm that no amount of planning could fully contain. What was most striking, perhaps, was the contrast between public perception and private reality. Outside the palace walls, the announcement might have seemed procedural, orderly, almost ceremonial. But inside, it was seismic. The emotional undercurrent, the tension, the fear of missteps, and the anticipation of public reaction combined to create an atmosphere of high drama. And Harry, caught in the eye of this storm, was forced to navigate not only his personal feelings of betrayal, but also the strategic implications of how he would respond. And then there was the question of legacy. Harry has always been conscious of how he is perceived, of the story that history will tell. This announcement challenged that narrative directly. William stepping forward as a central figure reshaped the family hierarchy, and with it, the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved. For Harry, this was not simply a matter of ego. It was a matter of identity, purpose, and historical footprint. Every reaction, Every decision, every public statement from this point forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged against a backdrop of centuries of royal tradition. And the world watched. News outlets picked up the story within minutes. Social media erupted with speculation, and the commentary was relentless. Analysts debated the motivations, historians contextualized the shifts, and ordinary citizens weighed in with opinions that ranged from outrage to empathy. And at the center of it all was Harry, grappling with a personal upheaval that had just been made public, a private storm now playing out on a global stage. By the time the day had progressed, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The palace had set the stage, William's leadership was established, and Harry's response would define the next chapter of this unfolding drama. Alliances would shift, loyalties would be tested, and secrets long buried threatened to surface. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only alter the monarchy, but redefine the narrative of an entire generation of royals. But as the sun began to dip below the London skyline, and the world braced for the inevitable fallout, Harry received a message that would push him beyond fury, beyond disbelief, and into territory that no one, not even the palace, had anticipated. A message that promised to change the trajectory of the monarchy forever. And in that moment, the bombshell had only just begun. The corridors of Buckingham Palace were still echoing with the chaos of the announcement, but now Harry had retreated to a more private wing, a place where he could think, or at least attempt to think, away from the relentless gaze of staff, advisors, and the inevitable press leaks. But retreat, as it turned out, was only a temporary illusion. The storm inside him was far from calm. In fact, it had only intensified. His anger, raw and unfiltered, threatened to spill over in ways that could alter everything he had built, everything he believed about loyalty, family, and honor. What drives a man to fury when the world is watching, yet cannot intervene? Harry knew the cameras would catch snippets, the aides would whisper, and the palace would inevitably have to respond. And yet, he felt trapped between two worlds. The public one, where he had to maintain a semblance of composure, and the private one, where betrayal and frustration coursed through his veins like molten lava. Each heartbeat felt like a drum, a reminder that his position, his influence, his identity, were all suddenly in flux. Meghan was there, of course, calm, calculated, a stabilizing presence, though not without her own stakes in the drama. She had always understood the optics of power, the subtle games that play out behind closed doors, the careful choreography required to manage perception. And now, in this high-stakes moment, her ability to remain collected contrasted sharply with Harry's explosive reaction. He was pacing, voice rising, hands clenched, muttering under his breath as he attempted to articulate a sense of outrage that words could barely contain. How do you reconcile being a prince, bound by centuries of duty, and feeling like an outsider in your own family? The private fury was fueled not only by the announcement itself, but by the symbolism it carried. William's ascendancy was not merely a transfer of responsibility. It was a statement of dominance, a declaration that the narrative had shifted. Harry, who had always sought to carve his own path, now faced the stark reality that the path he envisioned for himself was being redirected by forces largely beyond his control. And in that redirection, there was an implicit question. Where did he, the prince who had challenged the status quo before, fit into this new monarchy? Insiders described the scene as chaotic. Doors slammed. Voices escalated. Papers were scattered in frustration. And yet, amid the storm, Harry's mind raced through the implications. Every ally, every friend, every loyalist within the palace network suddenly seemed to have a role in this unfolding drama, and every interaction was laden with unspoken judgment. Who had supported the move behind the scenes? Who had whispered in the right ears to ensure William's position? And most importantly, who had betrayed him in ways both overt and subtle? Meghan, ever the strategist, leaned in with calm authority. "Think before you act," she advised, her tone low, measured. "Every word, every move, every public reaction, they're all being watched. We control what we can, Harry. Focus on that." But Harry's rage was barely contained. Focus was difficult when betrayal burned through your veins like fire. He wanted to confront, to question, to demand answers. Yet he knew that the palace had mechanisms to protect its narrative, and that any misstep on his part could have repercussions far beyond personal humiliation. And the letters? The letters were the silent, invisible threat hanging over his head. Reports had surfaced, cryptic, heavily redacted, yet undeniably revealing, that certain communications had been shared, misinterpreted, or strategically positioned to influence the timing and framing of the announcement. Could it be true? Could someone within the palace, someone he trusted, have manipulated events to this degree? And if so, for what purpose? The questions piled upon each other, heavy, relentless, unanswerable in the moment. Harry's fury, however, was not merely strategic, it was deeply personal. He had invested years of effort into causes, public service, and maintaining a connection with both the monarchy and the public. And now, that investment seemed minimized, almost irrelevant in the shadow of William's ascendancy. How does one measure legacy when the very institution meant to honor it shifts beneath their feet? How does a man maintain dignity when his position, his significance, is suddenly called into question? And then came the flashpoint, the message that had just arrived, succinct but explosive, confirming details of the announcement before he had even processed it fully. The reality of the shift hit him with an intensity that words cannot fully capture. He stormed from room to room, his voice bouncing off the walls, his frustration escalating with each step. Staff moved quickly to intercept, advisors attempted to counsel, but the fire had already ignited. It was not just anger, it was a sense of injustice, of being marginalized in the very institution that defined him. The palace, of course, anticipated reactions like this. They had prepared for media scrutiny, public interpretation, and the ripple effect on global perception. But preparation cannot fully account for raw human emotion, especially when it is compounded by betrayal, public exposure, and personal stakes. Harry's response, unfiltered and potent, became a story in itself, a glimpse into the human side of royalty, the vulnerability behind the public facade. And then there was the contrast. Meghan, composed and deliberate, was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Every conversation, every glance, every subtle signal was part of a strategy designed to protect Harry's image while navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics. She recognized the danger of unbridled fury in a man who is both a prince and a global figure. She also understood the power of perception, how a single misinterpreted action could ripple across the world in minutes. But Harry was not ready to think strategically. He was ready to react. His fury demanded action, his pride demanded acknowledgement, and his sense of injustice demanded resolution. The palace was a theater of control, and he felt, in that moment, like a performer who had been written out of the script. How do you reclaim agency when the narrative has already been constructed? How do you assert influence when the world expects composure, restraint, and adherence to tradition? And yet, amid the fury, there were moments of clarity. Harry's mind, racing with anger, also considered the implications of restraint, of measured response, of patience. He knew that every action, every word, every social media post, every public appearance would be dissected. Missteps could be catastrophic, both personally and for the monarchy at large. But restraint is difficult when betrayal feels immediate, personal, and undeniable. Advisors whispered, aides shuffled papers, and Meghan continued to offer guidance, each suggestion a lifeline in the storm of emotion. Yet, the question remained, how far would Harry allow his fury to dictate his actions? How much of the prince's response would be dictated by instinct versus calculation? And most importantly, how would this private fury eventually manifest in the public eye? As hours passed, the palace remained a hive of tension. Every step, every whisper, every glance was charged with potential consequence. Harry's fury was no longer private. It was a force that would inevitably ripple outward, affecting allies, adversaries, and observers alike. The stage was set for a confrontation, not just with family, not just with the palace, but with history itself. And just when it seemed Harry might finally contain himself, a new development arrived. An unexpected phone call, a message from a source he thought loyal, delivering information that would escalate his anger, fuel his sense of betrayal, and set the stage for decisions that could redefine his place in the monarchy forever. The private fury was only the beginning. The storm was gathering strength, and the world had yet to see its full force. But what came next would push Harry to his breaking point, and no one inside or outside the palace was prepared for the fallout. While Harry's fury boiled over, Meghan remained a study in composure. In the midst of the palace chaos, she moved with deliberate precision, eyes scanning, mind calculating, every gesture measured, every word considered. To the casual observer, it may have seemed as though she was unaffected, even indifferent, but those closest to her knew better. Meghan understood the stakes, the optics, and the fragile balance of perception. She knew that Harry's anger, as human and justified as it was, could easily become a public spectacle, one that the palace, the media, and critics would seize upon with relish. And she also knew that in this pivotal moment, her calm was a weapon, subtle, strategic, and incredibly powerful. How does one remain poised when the world is in upheaval, when your partner is storming through corridors in a mixture of rage and disbelief? Meghan's approach was methodical. She anticipated every reaction, every misstep, every external commentary. Her strategy was to be a stabilizing force for Harry, while simultaneously controlling the narrative from behind the scenes. In her mind, every public emotion was data, every leak was a tool, and every whisper of palace gossip was a clue. She had been in this arena before, navigating press scrutiny, managing public perception, and balancing personal ambition against public duty. And she knew that patience was just as powerful as fury. Her calm was not merely for show, it was a shield. She recognized that Harry's outbursts, no matter how understandable, could be weaponized by critics. Images of him storming, muttering, or slamming doors would circulate instantly. Analysts would interpret every gesture, historians would dissect motives, and public opinion would swirl in unpredictable ways. Meghan's restraint provided a counterbalance, a lens through which Harry's actions could be framed more strategically. She was the anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep them both away. Yet, Meghan was not simply reactive, she was proactive. She began mapping out potential responses, drafting messages, preparing allies, and identifying channels through which information could be controlled. Every conversation she initiated, every phone call she made, every subtle glance exchanged with Harry was part of a larger game plan. This was not about suppressing emotion. It was about channeling it in ways that could preserve influence, reputation, and leverage. But even with strategy and calculation, there were moments of tension. Harry, still reeling from the palace announcement, struggled to contain his anger long enough to consider Meghan's advice. His emotions were raw, visceral, and immediate, while Meghan's approach demanded foresight, patience, and discipline. It was a classic clash, instinct versus strategy, emotion versus calculation. And the stakes were impossibly high. One misstep, one poorly timed reaction, could amplify the drama in ways neither could fully control. Meghan's calm also served as a contrast, a mirror reflecting the magnitude of Harry's fury back at him, making it both more potent and more manageable. In their private moments, she would ask pointed questions, challenging him to think beyond the immediate eruption of anger. "What will this look like in the press?" she asked once, her voice steady but firm. "What do you want the world to see? And how do we ensure your story isn't hijacked by others?" These were not rhetorical questions. They were probes into strategy, designed to transform raw emotion into calculated action. And yet, there was a deeper layer to her calm. Meghan understood that perception mattered as much as reality. The palace, the media, and the public would judge not only what Harry did, but also how he did it. Images of him shouting or slamming doors could overshadow decades of service, charity work, and public engagement. Her restraint was a way of preserving the narrative, a subtle form of power that relied not on noise, but on control. At the same time, Meghan was keenly aware of the emotional dynamics at play. She knew Harry's fury was rooted in a sense of betrayal, in the sudden reshuffling of roles and recognition within the monarchy. But she also recognized that his anger could be harnessed constructively, if guided correctly. Her task was to ensure that his response, however impassioned, would ultimately reinforce their position rather than undermine it. The contrast between them created a tense yet effective dynamic. Harry was the storm, unpredictable, forceful, and emotional. Meghan was the eye of the storm, calm, deliberate, and calculating. Together, they navigated the palace with a combination of instinct and strategy, emotion and calculation, fury and composure. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant negotiation and awareness of every nuance, every subtle signal, every potential threat. Publicly, Meghan's demeanor was equally calculated. She knew that appearances mattered, that even the slightest display of frustration or irritation could be amplified, misinterpreted, and weaponized. In front of cameras, she remained composed, projecting strength, confidence, and control. Yet privately, she was intensely engaged, managing communications, monitoring the palace's internal dynamics, and advising Harry on how to channel his emotions in ways that would maximize their strategic advantage. And then came the whispers. The palace had begun to stir with speculation, and Meghan was immediately attuned to the implications. She knew that insiders were talking, that advisors were taking sides, and that information could leak at any moment. Her calm allowed her to assess threats objectively, to anticipate potential fallout, and to prepare contingencies. Every move, every word, every interaction was part of a larger chess game, and Meghan was determined to ensure they remained several steps ahead. At one point, a senior aide attempted to intervene, suggesting that Harry might need to apologize publicly or issue a statement to quell speculation. Meghan quietly but firmly countered, recognizing that such a move could backfire if timed incorrectly. "Not yet," she advised. "Let him breathe. Let the storm rage internally. We'll respond when it matters strategically, not reactively." Her patience, calculated and deliberate, contrasted sharply with the immediacy of Harry's fury. But it was precisely this balance that allowed them to navigate the escalating tension. The dynamic was fascinating. Harry, the emotional center, reacting instinctively to perceived betrayal and shifts in family hierarchy. Meghan, the strategic center, channeling, guiding, and calibrating each response for maximum effect. Together, they formed a unit capable of both immense passion and extraordinary calculation, a combination that made them unpredictable and formidable in equal measure. And yet, beneath the strategy and composure, there was a tension that could not be ignored. Harry's anger, though managed, remained potent. Meghan's calm, though controlled, was a form of power that carried its own risks. The interplay of emotion and calculation created a high-stakes environment in which every action had consequences, every decision mattered, and every misstep could reverberate far beyond the palace walls. As the day wore on, Meghan continued to guide, advise, and observe. She anticipated the palace's moves, monitored media speculation, and prepared Harry for the inevitable confrontations that would follow. Her calm was not passive. It was active, strategic, and deeply intentional. She understood that in moments of crisis, control over perception was as crucial as control over action, and she wielded that control with precision. But the true test of her calm came when Harry received another message. One that confirmed suspicions about palace alliances, internal maneuvering, and the extent of the betrayal he had feared. Meghan's reaction was measured, her face unreadable, yet inside, she recognized the gravity of what this meant. The storm was far from over, and her ability to guide Harry through it would be tested like never before. And just when it seemed that their strategy might hold, a sudden revelation arrived. A leak, a whisper, a piece of information so explosive that it threatened to shatter the delicate balance Meghan had maintained. It was a moment that demanded immediate attention, decisive action, and calculated response. And for the first time that day, even Meghan's composure was put to the test. Because in the world of royalty, strategy and emotion are inseparable, and the next move could change everything. But what Meghan did next, her choice, her action, her intervention, would not only redefine Harry's response, but alter the course of the palace drama in ways no one anticipated. The palace had barely begun to recover from the immediate fallout of the announcement when whispers of another scandal began to circulate, one that threatened to eclipse even Harry's fury and Meghan's calculated calm. Secret letters, some decades old, others surprisingly recent, had surfaced, or at least their existence had been confirmed by multiple insiders. The contents were shrouded in secrecy, heavily guarded within palace archives. Yet rumors suggested that they contained explosive information, private admissions, critiques of family members, and insights into alliances and betrayals that no one outside the inner circle was meant to see. Imagine holding in your hands a document that could rewrite history, not just yours, but the narrative of a dynasty spanning centuries. That was the weight of these letters. And for Harry, the timing couldn't have been worse or more telling. They seemed to arrive precisely when the palace announcement had redefined his position, almost as if history itself were mocking him. Every whisper of their content sent ripples through the royal corridors. Who had authorized their release or leak? Who stood to gain from their exposure? And, most crucially, how much of what they contained was true? The letters were, in many ways, a map of the palace's power dynamics. Some were communications between senior advisors and family members, laying bare intentions, frustrations, and strategic plans. Others were personal notes from past generations, offering praise, critique, or guidance, often in ways that suggested favor or disfavor toward Harry. When taken together, the letters painted a picture of a monarchy rife with internal calculation, where loyalty, influence, and perception mattered more than bloodlines or public service. Harry's reaction to the news was immediate. Where fury had previously been directed at the announcement itself, it now expanded to the realization that his private thoughts, his actions, and his reputation might be further manipulated through these leaks. Every moment of his life, every decision, could now be reframed by the contents of letters he hadn't even seen. The implications were staggering. These documents could undermine decades of careful image management, reveal private tensions, or suggest collusion with those he thought allies. And yet, there was intrigue beyond Harry's personal stakes. The letters contained details that implicated other members of the royal family, potentially challenging their public personas and long-held narratives. Historical grievances were illuminated, alliances questioned, and actions once considered noble or loyal suddenly appeared self-serving. For historians, biographers, and palace insiders, the letters were a treasure trove of insight. For Harry, they were a potential weapon or a dangerous exposure. Meghan's response, as always, was measured. She recognized both the risk and the opportunity. The letters could validate their grievances, shed light on past betrayals, and provide a framework for Harry's public narrative. Yet, they could also be weaponized, twisted, and used against them. She advised caution, patience, and a strategy for managing the inevitable fallout. Calm in the midst of revelation, she balanced the emotional urgency of Harry's reaction with a calculated approach designed to preserve control. As the details of the leaks began to trickle into the media, carefully curated, of course, public speculation skyrocketed. Headlines hinted at betrayal, secrecy, and scandal. The narrative was irresistible. The monarchy, already destabilized by Harry's departure and William's ascendancy, now faced a historical revelation that questioned motives, loyalty, and trust within the family. Every royal watcher had questions. Every journalist sought answers. And every rumor magnified the intensity of the unfolding drama. One of the most shocking elements of the leaked letters involved alliances that Harry had believed were steadfast. Privately, advisors and family members had expressed doubts, criticism, or even contempt, and these sentiments had been captured in writing. For Harry, reading or learning about these letters was like discovering a hidden dimension of betrayal. What he had perceived as support, loyalty, or mutual understanding now appeared fragile, conditional, or strategically motivated. The palace, it seemed, had long been a chessboard of influence, and he was suddenly realizing how many moves had been made without his knowledge. The timing of the letter's exposure added an almost cinematic layer to the drama. Released shortly after William's formal assumption of greater leadership responsibilities, they seemed designed, or perhaps coincidentally timed, to maximize impact. Harry's emotional state was already heightened. The revelation of these documents pushed him further toward a breaking point. Allies and advisors scrambled to manage the optics, but the palace had little control over the swirling speculation outside its walls. Social media, blogs, and international media outlets erupted with commentary, analysis, and unverified claims. And within this storm, Harry faced a critical decision. Should he confront the contents head-on, respond publicly, or maintain silence and strategize privately? Each option carried risks and rewards. Confrontation could assert his narrative, but also amplify exposure. Silence might preserve privacy, but allow others to control the story. Strategizing required patience and foresight, qualities tested by the immediacy of emotional turmoil. And through it all, Meghan continued to offer guidance, her calm providing a counterweight to Harry's instinctive desire to react. The letters also revealed contradictions that complicated the narrative. Some praised Harry's past efforts, acknowledging his contributions to charity, public service, and the modern image of the monarchy. Others, however, questioned his motivations, critiqued his decisions, and suggested that his actions had been self-serving. The tension between praise and criticism created a complex portrait, one that could be spun in multiple ways depending on the audience and the storyteller. For Harry, the contradictions were both infuriating and enlightening. They confirmed his sense of being misunderstood, yet highlighted the necessity of controlling the narrative more than ever. And then there were the shocking secrets. Certain passages hinted at private agreements, strategic maneuvering, and even potential conflicts of interest among palace insiders. These were not minor details. They were revelations capable of altering public perception, challenging long-held assumptions, and redefining the very structure of power within the monarchy. The weight of these secrets was immense. For Harry, the challenge was not merely processing the information, but deciding how, or if, to act on it without exacerbating the situation. Media speculation intensified as excerpts of the letters were leaked selectively, fueling public debate. Analysts dissected every sentence, historians contextualized the revelations, and social media erupted with theories, memes, and commentary. Every post, every article, every headline became a new battleground, amplifying the emotional stakes and ensuring that Harry and Meghan were navigating not only internal palace dynamics, but a global audience hungry for drama. Amid all this, the personal toll on Harry was palpable. The letters forced him to reconsider alliances, question motives, and reevaluate the foundation of trust within his own family. Rage, betrayal, and disbelief were constant companions, making each decision heavier, each interaction more charged. Yet even in the face of this revelation, Meghan's calculated calm offered a guiding hand, a reminder that strategy and restraint could still shape outcomes despite the chaos. And just when it seemed the storm of letters had reached its peak, a new detail emerged, one that suggested a far deeper conspiracy than anyone had anticipated. A revelation within the letters hinted at decisions being made years prior, decisions that directly affected Harry's role, his responsibilities, and the trajectory of his public and private life. The depth of manipulation suggested intentionality, a careful orchestration of events that made the palace announcement appear inevitable, predestined, and unavoidable. The implications were staggering. Harry's fury, Meghan's strategy, and the palace's careful choreography were all now intertwined with the shadow of long-buried secrets. How they responded in the next hours would shape not only the public narrative but the personal dynamics of a family under extraordinary scrutiny. And as the evening descended on London, it became clear that the secret letters were not merely a side note. They were a catalyst. They had the power to ignite decisions, provoke confrontations, and alter the trajectory of the monarchy in ways few could predict. But one particular passage, the most shocking of all, had yet to be revealed. And when it finally surfaced, it would push Harry, Meghan, and the palace into uncharted territory, a confrontation that no one would see coming. While Harry grappled with fury and Meghan maintained her strategic calm, the spotlight inevitably shifted to Prince William. The heir apparent, now stepping fully into the role the palace had just formalized. William's ascent was not abrupt. It was the culmination of years of preparation, subtle positioning, and deliberate cultivation of public and internal support. And yet, the timing of the announcement gave his rise an almost cinematic gravity, setting the stage for a new era of monarchy while simultaneously challenging Harry's sense of identity, influence, and legacy. The first question on everyone's mind was simple but loaded. How had William managed to consolidate so much authority so swiftly? Those close to the palace explained that the process had been years in the making, a meticulous orchestration of timing, alliances, and calculated visibility. Advisors were groomed to support his leadership, public engagements were strategically designed to bolster his image, and key decisions were made quietly behind closed doors to ensure continuity and stability. The palace's announcement was the public confirmation of a transition that had already been underway in practice. William's rise was multifaceted. On one hand, it was symbolic. He represented continuity, stability, and the reassuring presence of the monarchy in a world increasingly skeptical of tradition. On the other hand, it was practical. The decision to centralize leadership under his direction streamlined decision-making, coordinated public relations strategies, and provided a clear line of authority within the royal family. The optics were brilliant. William appeared calm, competent, and in control, the ideal counterbalance to Harry's volatility. And yet, behind the composed exterior, William's approach was far from passive. He had carefully studied the dynamics of the family, the palace, and public perception, identifying leverage points and potential obstacles. His relationships with senior advisors, staff, and even certain family members were nurtured over time, ensuring that when the moment arrived, he would step forward with support, legitimacy, and momentum. Every public appearance, every media statement, every charity engagement had been strategically deployed to build credibility and reinforce the narrative of leadership. The implications for Harry were stark. William's consolidation of power did more than elevate his own profile. It effectively redefined Harry's position within the monarchy. What had once been a shared sense of responsibility, a balance between brothers, now tilted decisively toward William. For Harry, this shift was more than symbolic. It was personal. Every decision, every responsibility, every public role he had assumed suddenly seemed secondary, overshadowed by William's ascendancy. And the timing, in the wake of the palace announcement and the leaked letters, compounded the sense of betrayal and disillusionment. Observers noted that William's demeanor during this period was textbook strategic leadership. He projected confidence without arrogance, decisiveness without aggression, and accessibility without overexposure. Each movement was designed to reassure the public, stabilize the monarchy, and subtly position himself as the natural central figure. Unlike Harry, whose reaction was emotional and immediate, William's approach was measured, deliberate, and long-term. It was leadership crafted not in moments of fury, but through sustained, strategic action. And the public noticed. Within hours of the palace announcement, media coverage highlighted William's calm professionalism, juxtaposed against Harry's emotional response. Analysts praised his composure, historians contextualized his role within the line of succession, and social media buzzed with commentary about the contrast between the two brothers. Every image, every video clip, every carefully managed statement reinforced William's authority while indirectly emphasizing Harry's marginalization. But there was more at play than mere optics. William's rise also carried significant political weight. Within the palace, advisors and allies recognized that centralizing leadership under him would streamline decision-making on sensitive matters, from ceremonial duties to public engagement, charitable work, and international relations. It created a unified front, projecting strength, stability, and foresight. And in the eyes of the public and global observers, it reinforced the perception of a monarchy capable of adapting to modern challenges without losing its core identity. Yet, for Harry, the consolidation of William's power was not simply a matter of optics or efficiency. It was a personal challenge. Every family gathering, every ceremonial event, every public appearance now carried the weight of comparison. Where once he had shared the spotlight, he now found himself operating in its shadow. Decisions he had previously influenced or led were increasingly filtered through William's authority. It was a shift that demanded not only adaptation but also emotional resilience, a demand that Harry, in his current state of fury and disillusionment, struggled to meet. The palace, of course, understood the delicate balance. Advisors worked to manage both public perception and internal dynamics, ensuring that the transition in power appeared seamless while minimizing the risk of conflict. But even the most careful orchestration could not fully account for Harry's unpredictable temperament, his global media presence, or the potential for private grievances to become public crises. William's rising power, while strategically sound, inevitably generated tension, resentment, and emotional friction that could erupt at any moment. And the friction was compounded by external pressures. Media outlets, keenly aware of the contrast between the brothers, amplified every discrepancy, every reaction, every subtle expression. Public opinion became a third party in the family drama, scrutinizing actions, motives, and intentions. Every decision by William, every response by Harry, was analyzed in real time, magnifying both the stakes and the scrutiny. The interplay of private emotion and public perception created a volatile environment in which one misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Amid this landscape, William's strategy was clear: consolidate influence, maintain composure, and project authority. Every meeting, every engagement, every statement was a calculated step toward establishing a narrative of leadership that could withstand scrutiny, criticism, and the inevitable comparisons with Harry. He recognized that the future of the monarchy depended not only on tradition and ceremony, but also on perception, influence, and the careful management of internal dynamics. And yet, even as he rose, William remained aware of the emotional undercurrents. He knew that Harry's fury and Meghan's strategic maneuvering could disrupt the delicate balance, that leaks, missteps, or poorly timed reactions could challenge his authority, and that history would judge both the public and private dimensions of their interactions. Leadership, he understood, was as much about anticipating conflict as it was about projecting stability. By the end of the day, the contours of a new royal hierarchy were unmistakable. William's authority was solidifying, Harry's influence was under strain, and Meghan's strategic guidance was shaping responses behind the scenes. The palace, meanwhile, navigated the tension with careful diplomacy, managing both perception and internal communication to preserve order, continuity, and the appearance of stability. But just when it seemed that William's rise was uncontested, a subtle, but highly significant, challenge emerged. A report surfaced suggesting that certain palace advisors had begun questioning the speed and method of the transition, hinting at potential fractures within the network of support William had painstakingly cultivated. While minor on the surface, these murmurs threatened to complicate the consolidation of power, inject uncertainty, and create opportunities for Harry to strike back, or for outsiders to intervene. And so the stage was set. William, poised and authoritative, consolidating influence with strategic precision. Harry, simmering with fury and betrayal, navigating both personal and public challenges. Meghan, guiding with calculated calm, and the palace, attempting to manage the unfolding drama with foresight and control. The interplay of emotion, strategy, and perception created a dynamic tension that would define the next chapter of the monarchy's story. But as the evening drew on and William's authority appeared secure, an unexpected maneuver was revealed. A private message, a confidential meeting, a subtle shift in palace alliances that threatened to destabilize even the most carefully constructed plan. And what happened next would not only test William's leadership, but challenge Harry and Meghan in ways no one saw coming. The palace, though seemingly a bastion of tradition and ceremony, is also a labyrinth of influence, alliances, and quiet power plays. As William consolidated his authority and Harry seethed with fury, the hidden currents of court intrigue began to surface, revealing a network of loyalties, rivalries, and strategic maneuvering that few outsiders ever witness. What seemed like straightforward family dynamics was, in reality, a complex web of relationships, with advisors, courtiers, and even distant relatives holding sway over the flow of information, the shaping of decisions, and the framing of public perception. Harry, caught in the emotional maelstrom of the recent palace announcement and the revelation of secret letters, was acutely aware of these undercurrents, but not fully prepared for the depth and subtlety of them. Every ally he had counted on, every confidant he trusted, seemed to have a dual purpose: loyalty to him on one hand, and allegiance to the institution on the other. And when the letters hinted at hidden communications, private critiques, and strategic positioning, the sense of betrayal intensified. The question wasn't merely who could be trusted, but how deeply influence and power had already been shifted behind closed doors. Meghan, as ever, was analyzing these dynamics with a precision born of necessity. Her calm allowed her to observe the subtle signals others missed: a delayed response from an aide, a veiled comment in a briefing, a glance exchanged between two advisors. Every interaction was a piece of the puzzle, a hint at shifting alliances or potential vulnerabilities. She recognized that in this environment, perception could be as powerful as fact, and that navigating the delicate balance of loyalty and strategy would determine not only Harry's path, but the broader narrative of the monarchy itself. Within the palace, advisors were maneuvering carefully. Some sought to support William's ascent by reinforcing his authority, ensuring the announcement and subsequent engagements projected strength and stability. Others acted with caution, concerned that Harry's reaction, or Meghan's strategic interventions, could create disruptions that would destabilize both the public image and internal order. And still others had their own agendas entirely, leveraging the tension between the brothers to consolidate influence, gain favor, or assert relevance in a shifting hierarchy. One particularly striking example involved a senior advisor known for their discretion and institutional memory. On the surface, this individual maintained a posture of neutrality, offering guidance and counsel as needed. Yet behind the scenes, they were engaged in a subtle campaign to align key stakeholders with William's leadership, subtly undermining Harry's influence without overt confrontation. For Harry, who had believed in the solidity of certain loyalties, this revelation was both infuriating and enlightening. It underscored the fact that palace life is rarely as straightforward as it appears, and that even trusted figures may operate with hidden motives. The media, as always, amplified these internal dynamics with relentless scrutiny. Headlines hinted at palace division, anonymous sources suggested intrigue, and social media users dissected every report, every rumor, and every subtle signal. For Harry and Meghan, managing perception became a continuous task, requiring not only strategic thinking but constant vigilance. Each news story, whether accurate or speculative, had the potential to shift public opinion, influence advisors' behavior, and shape the narrative surrounding the monarchy's evolution. Tensions between factions within the palace began to manifest in meetings, memos, and briefings. Advisors advocating for William's rise were focused on continuity and stability, while those concerned about Harry's reaction pushed for measured engagement, transparency, or tactical communication. The interplay of these positions created an environment of cautious negotiation, subtle persuasion, and, at times, veiled conflict. Every decision carried weight, every recommendation was scrutinized, and every interaction had potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Harry, navigating this intricate landscape, found himself both a participant and an observer. His fury, while deeply personal, was now intertwined with the strategic dynamics of court intrigue. He had to consider not only his emotional response, but also how each action would influence alliances, advisor loyalties, and the perception of power within the palace. Every step required careful calculation, yet the immediacy of emotion made that calculation difficult. How do you act decisively without being impulsive? How do you assert influence without alienating allies? These questions defined the tension of the moment. Meghan's guidance became increasingly critical. She advised careful observation, deliberate questioning, and strategic timing. Every move has implications, she reminded Harry. Watch who speaks, who hesitates, who aligns themselves subtly. That's where influence lies. That's where the game is really being played. Her calm approach helped Harry channel his energy, transforming raw fury into a measured assessment of palace dynamics. The interplay between emotion and strategy, instinct and calculation, became a defining factor in how they navigated this intricate web of alliances. Meanwhile, the letters and leaks that had emerged earlier served as both fuel and roadmap. They revealed hidden criticisms, covert alignments, and historical tensions that shaped current alliances. Advisors who had once seemed neutral now revealed preferences, subtle hints at loyalty, or discreet efforts to influence outcomes. Each revelation forced Harry to reevaluate his assumptions, challenge prior beliefs about loyalty, and adjust his approach in real time. The emotional stakes were high. Every misjudgment could be amplified by the media, every misstep could be weaponized by adversaries, and every failure to recognize an ally's hidden agenda could compromise his position. Harry's awareness of the stakes heightened his emotional response, yet Meghan's guidance allowed him to navigate the situation with a growing sense of strategic clarity. Together, they began mapping out how to respond, when to assert influence, and how to protect both personal reputation and broader interests within the monarchy. At the same time, William's camp was not idle. Advisors supporting him monitored these dynamics carefully, identifying potential threats, gauging Harry's responses, and anticipating Meghan's interventions. They recognized that maintaining the narrative of calm, stable leadership required careful management of both public perception and private palace alliances. Every leak, every rumor, every subtle signal was analyzed for its potential to influence outcomes. And then came the tipping point. A seemingly innocuous conversation between two advisors revealed a subtle, yet significant